Hey guys, in this video I'm going to be showing you the Waves Signature Series plugins for bass guitar. In a previous video, I've demonstrated how to mix a bass guitar for pop rock music using conventional plugins like compressors and equalizers. In this video, I'm going to compare and contrast that method with just using the Signature Series plugins from Waves. So let's get started. I'm going to be using this mix that I used last time. Let me go through it. The tracks: drums, percussion, acoustic guitars, rhythm electric guitars, lead guitars, and then here are the bass plugins that I'm going to be focusing on this time. The first track I have here is the bass track that has the conventional plugins. I'm using a amp simulator plugin. This is Amplitude 3, the Ampeg collection. Then I have a set of plugins that I demonstrated in the previous video that are the typical or conventional way of mixing. Let me play you back the song, just the introduction part, so you can hear how the bass sounds in the mix right now using the conventional methods. Then what I'm going to do is I have the track duplicated over here, and I have the Signature Series plugins using the same amp simulator, and then we'll just compare and contrast the conventional method with the Wave Signature Series plugins, and I'll show you each of them back to back so you can hear one after the other and get a better idea of how they each sound. So let's get started. Here is the mix with the conventional bass sound. Alright, so that's the mix with the typical bass sound. Now let me show you the Waves Signature Series plugins. I have the track duplicated. Here's the bass track, and here's the one with the Waves Signature Series plugins. I'm going to mute this one. I'm going to unmute this one. The first thing right off the bat that I want to show you is that these plugins are mono to stereo plugins. So I just have this as a mono track right here. Each of these plugins will take that mono track. You'll see here, mono to stereo. This is the CLA bass, the Crystal Lord Algae bass plugin. So if you're the kind of person that likes to keep your bass in mono so it can be right in the center, if you want to do that, I'm typically that's my preference. What I'll do is just take the left and right and put them to the center. That's up to you. If you want to keep it panned out wide and have your bass guitar sound wide, that's your choice. The second thing that I want to show you is that these plugins have some kind of delay from them, processing delay that takes place. So what I'm going to do so that this track actually stays in line with the song rather than being 1,000 samples more than, or over 1,000 samples delayed in my mix is I'm going to take this number and I'm going to nudge the waveform back. I'll show you that in a second. But each of these has its own amount of delay. So really if you just put one on your track, it's only going to be 100 samples or maybe at the most around 600 samples depending on your plugin. That's just something to be aware of. There are many modern or the current versions of many DAW hosts will have automatic delay compensation built in. Even Pro Tools has it for the newer versions than I have. One thing to know about it, you can turn automatic delay compensation on and off, but the thing about it is if you're trying to track or do something like that, it's a problem. To have the delay, this kind of delay. Hundreds of samples of delay is a problem. 1,000 is a lot. You'll notice that it's out of time. So that's just something to watch when you're tracking. You don't want any delay, when you're mixing, you can tolerate it as long as you have all the tracks in your song delayed by the same amount. What I'm going to do so that all my tracks, rather than go over here and delay all these other ones so they're the same delay as this one, I'm just going to change this one, nudge it back so that when it actually plays back, it's the same as the other ones. So let me switch over here to this view. I'm going to click this one, go up to here. It was 1,126. If you make sure right here that this one is on, that's the keyboard control for the edit window. If you zoom in, I'm going to zoom in. This one I already adjusted based on the delay of the my other plugins that I was using. So I'm going to move it back here and move it back 1,026. So that's the number of samples. It's delayed back from the grid. I recorded it to the grid initially. However, if I look at my other one, this is the amount that I delayed it before. 1,000, whatever the samples from this one is. So I've adjusted it so that it's the right delay for all these tracks. Now let me play it back, and you can just hear what the amp sounds like. This is the Ampeg model from Amplitude 3. Alright, so that should give you a general idea. The bass part, the first thing that I notice is that some of the notes are louder than some of the other ones, and that's a problem. When you have your bass, you want it to basically just sit on top of the mix or sit under the mix, depending on how you want to describe it. But the thing is, you want it to sort of be the same level throughout. Obviously, different notes and things like that are going to be a little bit off, but for the most part, you want your bass to just sit there and be present in the mix. You don't want to have to turn it up or down a lot, things like that. You just want your bass to just be constant throughout your song whenever it's being played. So that's one of the issues I want addressed with this kind of processing. And that's good because a typical way to handle that is to use a compressor. So why don't I open up the first one? I have these just in alphabetical order. And I'll show you the Chris Lord Algae Signature Series plugin for bass guitar. The controls are pretty straightforward. You have an input fader over here on the left. You have an output fader here on the right. These control the volume of the plugin. This one controls the signal coming in. You can turn it up or down. And this one controls the signal at the output, as the name would suggest. The thing about the input fader is that when you have kind of dynamics processors like a compressor going on inside of the plugin, you want to have the signal at an appropriate level. That's when it's going to hit the compressor. So what you do is you use the input sensitivity fader right here to control the level as it's going to hit the compressor. So a compressor has different controls, things like a threshold, and in order for the compressor to be operating, the signal has to be above the threshold for the compressor to turn it down. So that's why you have an input fader that you want to turn the signal up so that it's in the right the amplitude level to be hitting the compressor. With the Signature Series bundles or Signature Series plugins that come in the bundles, they each have this indicator light right here on them, and you'll see when I play it back that the level can go from green to red. Typically, you don't want it to be always in the red, and you don't want it to always be in the green. You want it to be somewhere in the middle. In the red, that's probably hitting the compressor too hard. That means that too much of the signal is above the threshold. Some people might like that, and it's a matter of preference. If you don't want hit your compressor too hard, maybe you'll turn it down where it's more in the green. If you want it to really hit your compressor hard and really compress, then go into the red. The thing about it is the compress fader over here that you have the control of, some people would say you don't really have a lot of flexibility with the compressor inside of here because you only have one fader. You just have a couple different settings that you can select. but you don't have a lot of control. In fact, if you control the input sensitivity and the compressor together, I would say that you actually do have a fair amount of control, in the sense that you can turn it down, maybe drive it harder on the input, but then have a low compression setting on the fader. Things like that you can experiment with and maybe get some different results, in the sense that you don't have things like control of the ratio, or you don't have control over the attack and release that are typical in compressors. But by having these two controls working together, you can sort of get some different results. So I'll play it back and show you what the input fader is like. It's in green. All right, so the signal that I have going into the plugin isn't very loud, so even if I push it all the way up, I'm still not hitting the red. That's fine. It's not a big deal. I'm getting in the level that I want anyway. So I talked a little bit about the compressor over here, but let me take you through the other controls as well. So you have a little bit control of the equalization going on. You have a bass control and a treble control. And you have these three different settings. For the bass, you have sub, lower, and upper. The different settings that you have determine what frequency range you're going to be increasing or decreasing. With the sub, what you're doing is that's a lower frequency range, and it's that really low end that you're either boosting or cutting. Or you have the opportunity, a little bit higher frequency range, boost or cut, and even a little bit higher. These are still in the low frequency ranges. The plugin doesn't exactly tell you what frequencies you're boosting or cutting. It just sort of gives you an intuition about what bass frequency regions you're playing around with. Same thing with treble. He describes them and uses the terms in the plugin as honk, bark, and cut. So, again, I'll play around with these in a second so you can hear the different things. But it's basically, you're either boosting some kind of treble frequency or cutting it. And you control which frequency by these different settings. You can turn these things off also by going like this, and then these faders don't really do anything. Next, you have these different kinds of compressors. He describes them as push, spank, and wall. The wall is a limiter. These other ones are just a little bit different, and I'll show you them. The sub fader is a special kind of processing that Waves has like proprietary signal processing for, and this sub one that comes with the bass one is, I'll demonstrate the other plugin for you just so you have an idea about it. Under other, max bass from Waves. So this is a plugin, and what it's supposed to do is basically just roll off the low frequencies in your signal and replace them kind of with a synthesized bass signal. I don't know if synthesized is the correct word or not. You probably have to read more about the special kind of processing. But what it's supposed to do is allow you to emphasize the bass frequencies, but at the same time not overload the low end with your original bass signal. I'll do a video where I'm demonstrating this particular plugin in more detail so you can see really how it works and how it sounds, and compare and contrast what it sounds like with the original signal and the max bass. You'll see that in a different video, but in this one I just want to show you that that max bass kind of signal processing, I believe, is used here in the sub. You can sort of fade in and out that max bass proprietary signal processing that Waves has. What it does is just emphasizes harmonics to kind of trick your ears into thinking you're hearing more bass maybe than you're actually putting through your signal chain. So that's pretty cool. I'll demonstrate this and so you can hear how it sounds. You can turn it on and off like this. Next is the distortion. This is kind of some kind of overdrive built in specifically for bass into the plugin. I like this about the Crystal Algae plugin, that some of the other ones don't really have distortion built in. Depending on this kind of music, sometimes your bass sound calls for this kind of effect. Sometimes it doesn't. You can obviously turn it off, and then I'll demonstrate the 3 different kinds. They kind of go from subtle to a lot of overdrive or gain. Finally is the pitch or modulation effects. Again, you have control more or less here. Chorus, wide, and spreader. So they just sort of open up the stereo image. I will demonstrate them first. Typically, I don't like to use this kind of effect. Some people do. When I demonstrate that effect, I'll show you it in this with the signal panned stereo wide, so you can really hear what the effect sounds like, even though typically I like to just pan my bass to the center. So here's the plugin in use. Here we go. I'll just solo it and focus on the plugin. So all the effects are turned off right now. So I typically like to start and think about compressing the signal before EQing, just to get a better idea about the sound. The thing about the compressor is it changes the dynamics, so it's kind of difficult to compare maybe what the compressor is at low settings here with what it is high settings here. But you can see on the meter that it really levels out the higher settings you have. That's kind of squashing the bass too much for my taste. Switch between the other ones. Even that kind of shapes the tone compared to the last one. Finally, the limiter. Kind of like the spank, so I'm going to stick with that one. Take it through the equalizers now. The bass first. Really low. Open up the low end there. You can cut it too if you want to make sure that your bass doesn't overlap your kick drum. Different frequencies. It's a little bit higher. So to me that sounds a little bit boxy. So to my ears, I might cut that frequency. Let's move on to the top end. You can hear the different frequencies. So I think as the name would suggest here, the cut is that really high end that he likes, that Crystal Algae, I guess, is suggesting to take out. Because with bass, a lot of that high frequency is just like noise, finger noise and stuff like that. So using that really high frequency to pull it out. Kind of like how that was sounding. So I've used the upper right here to pull out. So you might be thinking, oh, well, what if you want to add some low end? You can't really add the sub here. This is where I'm going to add it in. That's that really low end. Gotta watch the output a little bit. Don't need to compress too much. Alright, now the distortion effects. That's subtle. Even if you start to push it, it's a little bit more. Roar. The growl probably is more appropriate for this kind of style of music. Rip that's a lot of distortion. Depending on your style of music, it might be appropriate. I'm gonna stick with some growl, just add a little bit extra interest in the top end. Alright, now widen it out so you can hear the stereo effects. This one's more subtle. For me, on bass, I'm not a person that likes to add a lot of effects in, whereas I might for guitar to thicken things up using modulation or pitch effects. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this one off. And I'm going to keep this setting so I can compare this one with maybe the other ones coming up, the Eddie Kramer, JJP, Tony Maserati. So you can hear, this is pretty much what I've decided that I like for this plugin. I'll move on to the next one now, or I'll bypass it and you can hear what I've done. Alright, now Eddie Kramer. This plugin doesn't have as many controls, but there are similar things. So you have this input sensitivity. Again, you're maybe shooting for the yellow range above green. Here's red. You can hear that with the sensitivity and the compressor maybe working together, there's a little bit of overdrive that can be added in, depending on if you really want to take it from more clean to saturated sounds. And you control the input and output together with the sensitivity. Compressor. There's the EQ. You really just have bass and treble. Those are pretty subtle. Showed the other setting, bass too. He has two different settings here, depending on what you want to make it sound like. I'll stick with the first one. Back off a little bit of that. I like that compressor a lot. Bypass it. Go back and forth now so you can hear it. So that makes it a little bit more growly of a bass sound. Next is JJP. This is the default setting when you open up the plugin. The basic controls for this one are over here on the left. You have the input sensitivity, and then your output fader is this master one. What the master does is it controls the input right here, and then all these parallel channels that go along with it too. So I'll take you through each of these in a second. I'll first start out with the basic sound, and the input one right here is going to go through the main fader right here. Then the main and all these other ones get summed together to the master fader. So here's just the DI setting, and I'll play around with the different controls here, EQ and compressor. So you gotta watch the output fader, or the output level. Really compress it, or just subtly compress it. Back out the highs or increase it. Alright, I'll show you the amp now. And finally, the synth setting. Alright, so that's the basic input section here on the JJP plugin. Now let me get into these parallel channels that you can mix in. So you have an edge channel right here. This one right here does a little bit of the kind of distortion, saturation sound, and I'll demonstrate it in a second. I don't know for certain, but it's possible that the distortion or the edge that's being added in is different for each of the DI, amp, and synth, but I don't know for certain. It might just be the same. Same with the other settings. I don't know if the attack, width, those things are identical, and really where the DI, amp, and synth, why he would have three different selections here, what parameters going on behind the scenes are being changed up. But I'll demonstrate some of them here so you can hear the edge attack. That controls like the snap or the initial transient of a note being played. The width is another kind of stereo thing, and I will pan this out wide so you can hear it again, the width as I fade it in. Sub is the same sort of max bass processing, I believe. Might just be some extra low end equalized using an EQ that you can fade in. Presence is some kind of mid-range EQ that you can bring in if you want to add that sound in. The length is kind of the sustain, the opposite of the attack. The sustain, you can bring up the length if you want your notes to hold out for longer. And you mix these in parallel with your main ones. You have to watch your master fader, make sure you're not bringing in too much level. So I'll start out and show you each of these along the way. Alright, so you can fade it in if you like that kind of drive to your bass. I actually don't, so I'm going to take it out. Here's how you can add some attack in. I actually don't like how it works with that bass sound. Here's the width. I don't think that's doing a whole lot for me, so I'm going to take it out. Just mixing a little bit of the sub. Hopefully Hopefully you can hear the presence sticking out now. Back it more to a reasonable range. And check out the length knob too. Alright, I'm going to check that out for the amp because I'm using the amp sim. Now, I don't really know if there's really that much of a difference, but I'm just gonna, I decided I kind of like the DI sound better. I don't know if that's because of the input stage or the parallel channels, but I'm gonna stick with the DI. Cool, just one more to go. Here's the Tony Maserati. Again, he has two settings, DI and synth. He has an input sensitivity knob with a color indicator and the output that you control together. And then for the DI setting, you just control the bass and the treble. Now the sensitivity also, with a lot of his, he has the compressor rolled into the sensitivity knob so that when you turn up the sensitivity into the red, you get more compression. When you're in this range, you just have less compression. You have to drive the output if you want to bring it up. You hear the frequencies of the bass and treble here. Now the synth. You can hear there's some kind of effects going on. Turn them up. Obviously, as the name suggests, these might be more appropriate for a bass synthesizer than an electric bass going through an amp. But I just want to demonstrate them so you can hear them. I'm going to switch back to the DI now. It's a very clean sound, very fat sound. Obviously, that's the sound that Tony Maserati is known for in a lot of his work. Having that rich low end, it's very thick and necessary for a lot of stuff he does, from hip hop to R&B to even that kind of Jason Mraz acoustic pop. You need to have that nice low end. Alright, so now what I'm going to do is take you through each of the plugins, bypass it coming in and out so you can hear how they sound back to back, just a side-by-side comparison to hear the differences. I've got them set up basically how I like it, and when I'm listening to it, how I think that the plugin sounds best with this signal. So I'll take you through the different sounds. Seems like I need to level match this one. Maybe this one turn down a little bit. Alright, Alright, so that should give you an idea how they sound side by side. But I'm going to show you now in the mix, switch between the different ones, bypassed all of them, and then go through them so you can hear. So I just want to describe a little bit about what I was hearing. This may just reinforce what you were also hearing too. I hope that's the case. With the CLA and the Eddie Kramer, I found that they were both added a little bit more of that extra growl or saturation, distortion sound. So if that's the kind of sound you want for your music, you might want to check those out. Obviously, those are effects that are built in on purpose. This is the distortion one here. With the Eddie Kramer, I was driving the sensitivity specifically to add a little bit of that sound. My impression of the JJP and the Tony Maserati were those were the ones that really had that fat, thick, full low end that a lot of times you need with your bass guitar. So if the sounds that you're mixing, the bass tracks that you're using a lot of times, you feel like they're lacking in that, you might want to check either one of these out. Just depending on what you think sounds best. You know, the main difference I think between each of these plugins, if you're looking for that fat, thick low end, and you're looking at the JJP versus Tony Maserati, the main thing that I notice is the amount of controls in the plugin. With Tony Maserati, it's very straightforward, very simple. You don't have a lot of things you have to worry about, just some knobs that you play around with a little bit, and it's going to sound pretty good. With JJP, you have a lot more controls. You have a lot more settings you have to worry about. And if you're the kind of person that likes to tweak, do stuff like that, maybe this one's for you if you're looking for that kind of sound. You have all these different controls over here, and you have the parallel ones that you can mix in. That might be a little bit more complicated for you and might waste too much of your time. You might want to go with something more straightforward with Tony Maserati. I think the same thing goes for the Eddie Kramer versus the CLA. I'll bring them up side by side. Eddie Kramer, simple, straightforward, just like Tony Maserati. The simple controls that you need and nothing else. So that's nice. If you don't want to have to worry about all that stuff, you just want to pull up a plugin, not have to mess around with too many parameters and what's going to make it sound good. Too many settings are a hassle for you. Having that, but you want that growly kind of bass sound. Eddie Kramer's the one for you. Curse Lord Algae, there's a lot more controls, a lot more settings you can play around with. If you like to tweak a lot, you want that kind of overdriven bass sound that's popular in rock music and even heavier kind of sounds. This one's the plugin that's got all the features to play around with. Again, it doesn't have the classical kind of parameters to tweak, things like compressor, thresholds, ratios, attack, release. You don't want to worry about all that. This one's just got the straightforward controls, but you can select different ones that'll give you different sounds. So these plugins are really just about listening with your ears, not having to worry about with your eyes looking at a frequency spectrum analyzer and pulling out different frequencies and doing all that stuff. It's really just about listening, what sounds good, Does this sound good? Great, I'll use it. If not, move on, try something else. So that's the main thing about these plugins. You don't have to be an expert. You just have to be a good listener. So with that, I'll let you guys hear I'll play out the track a little bit more. Again, I want to remind you, as in with the other videos, if you guys are interested in downloading, if you've got some of these plugins and you want to download this session from me, I've got it posted online. Just send me a private message on YouTube. I'll be happy to make this session available to you, even the stems of all the tracks, the bass track, the drums and things like that, so you can mix it however you like, try some things out. If you've got some of the plugins, test them out. Maybe you don't have them, you can always go on the Waves webpage, download the demos, and test them out on your own, depending on whatever plugins you've got. Just let me know if there are some that you have and some that you don't have. That doesn't really matter. I'll just make them inactive and send you the session. Or you can just get the stems from me. If you just want to mix them in your own DAW, maybe you don't use Pro Tools, whatever it may be, send me a message and we can make whatever you want to happen. I just want to encourage everyone to keep mixing, try out different things, and I think more than anything else, just getting more experience and looking at things from different perspectives. Again, if you got any feedback from me, things that you like to do that I haven't mentioned, feel free to post a message either below or on my YouTube channel, or send me a private message, and I'll try and incorporate some of those suggestions into some of my future videos. Maybe some unconventional ways of mixing I'll discuss next for the bass. Till then, check out my other videos, keep mixing, keep rocking out, and take care, guys.